Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a tense moment Yuri finds peace during a phone-free morning with Tu Tieu. But he doesn't know that while he sits in quiet safety, an urgent board meeting trap has already been set, and by evening he'll discover a fake email that changes everything. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The mist was still thick when Yuri arrived at the tea house that morning. His jacket was damp from the walk, his face tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tu Tieu saw it the moment he stepped through the door, the tension in his shoulders. The way his eyes kept flicking to his phone like it might explode if he looked away too long. "Good morning," she said softly, already moving toward the kettle. Yuri managed a small smile. He glanced down, frowning, and Tu Tieu's heart tightened. She'd seen this before, the way worry could consume someone until there was no room left for rest. She poured hot water over the tea leaves and let the steam rise between them. "I should check." 1 hour, Tu Tieu interrupted, her voice still soft but firm. "No phone. Just breathe, eat, and plan." Yuri looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might argue. His hand was already halfway to the screen. But then he saw her expression, not pleading, not demanding, just steady, and something in him softened. "What if it's urgent?" he asked quietly. Tu Tieu set the teapot down and met his eyes. "If they want you shaky, don't give them that gift." Yuri exhaled slowly. He looked at the phone one more time, then set it face down on the table and pushed it toward her. Tu Tieu smiled and slid a small plate of steamed buns toward him. 1 hour. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, the mist pressing softly against the windows. Yuri ate slowly, and Tu Tieu watched as his breathing deepened, as the tightness in his jaw began to ease. She poured him tea, and when he wrapped his hands around the warm cup, she saw his fingers relax. "There's a meeting today," Yuri said after a while, his voice low. "At the company. They didn't tell me until late last night." Tu Tieu's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "What kind of meeting?" "Board meeting. Emergency session." Yuri's eyes were distant, troubled. "Something about governance procedures." "My mother thinks it's a trap," Tu Tieu's breath caught. "Does she know what they're planning?" Yuri shook his head. "Not yet, but she told me not to sign anything I haven't read twice." "Then you won't." Yuri looked at her, and his expression softened with gratitude. "I'm glad I came here first." Before they parted, Tu Tieu folded a small piece of paper and tucked it into Yuri's jacket pocket. "For when the room feels too loud," she said. In Tu Tieu's careful handwriting, it read, "You are not alone. Breathe, think, choose." Then he picked up his phone, took a deep breath, and left for the office. The construction company office was already humming with tension when Yuri arrived. Assistants moved quickly through the hallways, clutching folders and whispering to each other. The usual morning calm had been replaced by something sharp and urgent. Yuri stopped at his desk and opened his email. At the top of his inbox, marked with a red flag, was a message sent at 6:47 a.m. Subject: Urgent Emergency Board Meeting, Immediate Governance Update. Yuri's pulse quickened. He scanned the email. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., less than an hour away. Attendance was mandatory for all senior managers. An attachment labeled Policy V10 was included. He opened it. The document was dense, filled with legal language and procedural terms that made his head spin. Words like interim authority, provisional oversight, and emergency delegation jumped out at him, but the meaning was slippery, vague. A colleague passed by his desk and leaned in. Yuri nodded. "What's this about?" The colleague lowered her voice. "No one knows. It wasn't on the schedule yesterday. Some people are saying it's about restructuring, others think it's about your mother. Yuri's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Thanks. When the colleague left, Uri pulled out his phone and texted Mrs. Ngia. Did you see the meeting notice? Her reply came quickly. Yes. Do not sign anything. I'm reviewing the document now. I will speak first. Yuri exhaled slowly and tucked the phone away. He thought of Tu Tieu's note in his pocket and felt steadier. In her office, Mrs. Ngia sat at her desk with the printed copy of the Policy V10 document spread out in front of her. Her reading glasses rested on the bridge of her nose, and her expression was calm but sharp. She'd seen tactics like this before, documents introduced at the last minute, meetings called with barely enough time to prepare, pressure disguised as urgency. It was designed to make people confused, to make them sign without thinking. But Mrs. Ngia had learned long ago that rushing was a weapon, and patience was a shield. She picked up her phone and called the company secretary. I'd like to request the original board authorization for this meeting. Also, the email distribution list and the timestamp of when the policy document was first created. The secretary hesitated. Mrs. Ngia, the meeting is in 40 minutes. Then I suggest you work quickly, Mrs. Ngia said, her tone polite but unyielding. She hung up and made a second call to Uri. Ngia said, when they ask you to sign, read everything twice. If the language is vague, do not proceed. If they pressure you, stall politely. I will. Good. Mrs. Ngia paused, then added gently, a rush decision is someone else's decision. Remember that. I will, Mum. Mrs. Ngia set the phone down and looked out the window. The sky was grey and heavy, but she felt clear. This meeting was a trap. She just needed to spring it carefully. The boardroom was large and cold, with a long polished table and high-backed chairs that made everyone look smaller. The overhead lights were too bright, casting sharp shadows. Yuri took his seat near the middle, his hands folded on the table, his breathing slow and controlled. Mrs. Ngia sat at the far end, her posture dignified, her expression calm. She had a slim folder in front of her, and her eyes scanned the room carefully, noting who was present and who avoided her gaze. She wore a tailored grey suit, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression pleasant and professional. She carried a leather portfolio and smiled warmly at the board members as she took her seat. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Lin began, her voice smooth and gracious. I know this is unusual, but given recent events, we felt it was important to act quickly. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. What exactly are we voting on? Lin opened her portfolio and slid copies of the document across the table. This is a temporary governance procedure designed to ensure stability during periods of uncertainty. It outlines interim authority structures and risk management protocols. Mrs. Ngia's voice cut through the room, calm and clear. Lin's smile didn't falter. It was drafted last week by our legal consultant. Which consultant? Mrs. Ngia asked. Lin's eyes flickered just for a second, but she recovered smoothly. An external advisor. The name is in the footnotes. Mrs. Ngia opened the document and flipped to the last page. The footnote listed a firm name, but no individual. I'd like to see the original authorization for this procedure. Who requested it and who approved the drafting process? Lin's smile tightened slightly. Mrs. Ngia, with respect, this is about moving forward, not litigating the past. It's about transparency, Mrs. Ngia replied evenly. If we're being asked to approve a governance change, we should know who initiated it. The tired board member nodded slowly. That's a fair question. Lin's jaw tensed, but she kept her voice light. Of course, I can provide that information after the meeting. Then perhaps we should delay the vote until that information is available, Mrs. Ngia said. Lin's mask cracked just slightly, her tone sharpened. Mrs. Ngia, delaying this creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates risk. Surely you understand that. Mrs. Ngia's gaze didn't waver. I understand that rushing creates mistakes. The room went quiet. Uri watched his mother, his chest swelling with pride. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't accusing. She was simply refusing to be moved. During a brief recess, Uri stepped into the hallway to get some air. Tuan's assistants approached him with a clipboard. Mr. Uri, the man said politely, we just need you to sign here as a witness. Standard acknowledgement that you were present for the discussion. Uri looked down at the paper. The language was vague phrases like acknowledges the necessity of interim measures and supports procedural continuity. It looked harmless, but something about it felt wrong. What exactly am I acknowledging? Uri asked. The assistant blinked, surprised. Just that you were here. It's routine. Yuri's hand didn't move toward the pen. I'd like to review this with legal counsel first. The assistant's smile faded. Mr. Uri, this is just a formality. I won't sign something I don't fully understand. Uncooperative. Uri met his gaze calmly. Then tell Mr. Tuan I'm being careful, not uncooperative. The assistant left, and Uri reached into his pocket and touched Tu Tieu's note. Breathe. Think. Choose. He exhaled slowly and felt his heartbeat steady. Back at the tea house, Tu Tieu was cleaning the kitchen when she noticed an old cardboard box tucked under the side table. It had been there for weeks. Uri had brought it over months ago, saying it contained old company files his mother wanted stored somewhere safe. Curious, Tu Tieu opened it. Inside were faded employee directories, staff lists, and internal newsletters from years past. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something told her to look anyway. She flipped through an old company directory from 5 years ago. The names were listed alphabetically, along with departments and roles. She scanned slowly, her finger tracing down the columns. Then she stopped. There, listed under legal consultants, contract basis, was a name. Tu Tieu frowned. The name seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. She kept reading. Next to the name was a notation. Emergency contact, Lin Pham. Tu Tieu's breath caught. Lin's last name. She flipped to another page, a staff photo from a company retreat. In the corner of the photo, standing together and smiling, were Lin and a man in a suit. The caption read, Legal Team and Advisory Board, 2021. Tu Tieu's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and took a picture of the page, then kept searching. In another file, she found an internal memo about procedural updates signed by the same consultant, Duong Min Hai, and copied to Mr. Tuan. The trap wasn't new. It had started years ago. Back in the boardroom, Mrs. Ngia stood and addressed the group. Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. I am formally requesting a delay of this vote, she said. I want an independent review of this document. Access to the original email authorizations and IT logs showing when this policy was created and who had access to it. One of the board members, a woman in her 50s, nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. Lin's face flushed slightly, but she kept her composure. Mrs. Ngia, we are trying to protect this company. So am I, Mrs. Ngia interrupted gently, by making sure we understand what we're approving. The tired board member cleared his throat. I agree with Mrs. Ngia. Let's reconvene in 2 days with the requested documentation. Lin's smile was tight. her eyes cold. Very well. As the meeting adjourned, Mrs. Njia gathered her papers calmly. She had won a small victory not by force, but by patience. That evening, Uri stood outside the company building, the sky turning dark above him. His phone buzzed. It was Tu Tieu. "Uri," she said urgently, "I found something." "What is it?" "There's a name in the old company directory. A legal consultant named Duong Min Hai. His emergency contact was Lin, and he worked on procedural documents with Mr. Free. Tuan, 5 years ago." Yuri's heart pounded. "You're sure? I have photos." "Yuri, this didn't start last week. They've been planning this for years." Yuri closed his eyes, his mind racing. "Can you send me the photos?" "Already done." Yuri opened the message and stared at the images. The name, the connection, the timeline. It was all there. "Tu Tieu," he said softly. "You just gave us proof. What do we do now?" Yuri looked back at the building, his jaw set. "We request the IT logs. If this consultant helped create the new policy, there will be digital fingerprints. And if Mr. Tuan and Lin tried to hide it, we'll find that too. I'll keep looking. There might be more." "Thank you," Yuri said, his voice warm despite the cold night. "For caring. For finding this. I care about your mother," Tu Tieu said, "and I care about you." Uri smiled, his chest tight with gratitude. "I know." They hung up, and Uri started walking toward his car. His phone buzzed again. Another email. Subject: revised meeting. Notice board session postponed. The message was polite, professional, but something about the header looked wrong. And when he checked the sender's email address, he noticed a tiny detail. An extra letter in the domain name. His stomach dropped. This wasn't from the company. It was a fake. And if someone was sending fake emails, it meant they were trying to control who showed up and who stayed away. Yuri's hands tightened around his phone. He turned and walked back toward the building, his heart pounding but his steps steady. The trap was bigger than he'd thought. But now, he could see it. Yuri begins his morning with a peaceful, phone-free hour at Tu Tieu's tea house, unaware that an emergency board meeting has just been called. At the office, Lin presents a suspicious governance procedure designed to strip Mrs. Njia of her authority. Gia refuses to be rushed. She calmly demands original documents, timestamps, and transparency, forcing the board to delay their vote. When Yuri is pressured to sign a vague witness statement, he politely refuses, staying true to his mother's guidance. Meanwhile, Tu Tieu discovers something crucial in old company files. A legal consultant connected to both Lin and Mr. Tuan from 5 years ago. Proof the trap was planned long before. As Yuri prepares to use this evidence, he receives what appears to be a company email, but the header is fake. Someone is controlling information, and the conspiracy runs deeper than anyone realized.